It was a cold evening when the phone lines at the 911 call center were unusually quiet. Operators sat at their desks, listening to the low hum of computers and the occasional buzz of a call coming in. Then a voice broke through. On the other end of the line was an elderly man. His voice trembled, not from panic, not from injury, but from something far more unusual. He said softly, almost embarrassed, I'm hungry. I don't have anything to eat." The operator paused for a moment. Calls usually meant accidents, emergencies, fights, or someone in immediate danger. Rarely did someone call just to say they were hungry. The operator leaned closer to the headset, her voice calm and steady. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" There was silence for a few seconds, then the man sighed. "No, I'm not sick. I just don't have food in the house. I didn't know who else to call." "I'm sorry." Something about the way he apologized made the operator's heart ache. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone. He wasn't calling to cause trouble or demand help. He was calling because he had no other option left. He sounded tired, lonely, and almost ashamed for even asking. The operator quickly sent officers to the address. To her, it didn't matter if it wasn't a typical emergency. Hunger was an emergency, too. When she hung up the call, she kept replaying the man's voice in her head, frail, polite, and filled with a kind of sorrow that came only from years of being left behind. A short while later, a patrol car slowly rolled up to a small, worn-down house at the end of a quiet street. The paint on the walls was peeling, the yard was overgrown, and the porch light flickered weakly. It didn't look like anyone had been caring for the home for a long time. Two officers stepped out, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. They knocked on the front door. For a few seconds, there was no answer. Just when they were about to knock again, the door creaked open. Standing there was the man who had made the call. His frame was thin, his shoulders slightly bent from age. His clothes hung loosely on him, and his eyes looked weary, like someone carrying the weight of many years. But there was also a quiet dignity in the way he stood. He wasn't asking for pity. He had simply admitted the truth. The officers greeted him gently, not wanting to startle him. "Sir, we got your call. You said you were hungry?" The man nodded, almost shyly. "Yes, I'm sorry for bothering you. I didn't know who else to call. I don't have anything left in the fridge." The officers looked past him into the house. The dim light revealed a living room that was nearly empty. A few pieces of old furniture sat scattered around, some cushions torn, a blanket draped over a worn-out chair. The air was heavy, a mix of dust and loneliness. The man slowly stepped aside to let them in. His movements were slow, careful, as though every step required effort. Inside, the officers could see the truth of his situation. The refrigerator door hung slightly open, and when they peeked inside, there was nothing but a single bottle of water. The shelves were bare. No bread, no milk, not even a can of beans. The officers exchanged a glance. This wasn't just about being hungry for one night. This was about survival. This man was living with nothing. One officer asked gently, "How long has it been since you had a proper meal?" The man thought for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "I don't really remember. A few days, maybe more. I try to stretch what I have, but this time, I just ran out." He said it without complaint, without anger, as if he had gotten used to living like this. The officers could see it in his eyes. This wasn't the first time he had gone hungry. The man offered them a seat, apologizing for the state of the house. They sat with him, and as they talked, the pieces of his story began to come together. He was a veteran. He had once served his country with pride, wearing a uniform that represented courage and sacrifice. But now, years later, he was alone, surviving on a small pension that barely covered his medicine and bills. As he spoke, his voice cracked slightly, but he never asked for sympathy. He didn't complain about his circumstances. He spoke with quiet honesty, as though sharing his truth was already more than he was used to doing. The officers listened closely. They weren't just hearing a man talk about hunger. They were hearing the story of someone who had given so much, yet had been forgotten in return. The thought was hard to swallow. The man's eyes drifted toward the fridge again, and he smiled faintly, almost embarrassed. "I didn't mean to make a fuss. I just thought, maybe if someone could help me tonight, I'd be fine." That smile, forced and weary, struck the officers deeply. They had seen many things in their line of work: violence, accidents, tragedies. But something about this was different. This was quiet suffering, The kind that didn't make headlines. The kind that slipped under the radar until someone finally reached out. Outside, the neighborhood was calm, lights glowing in other homes where families were having dinner together. The contrast was stark. In those houses, people were eating, laughing, living. And in this house, an elderly man was surviving in silence, hoping for a little kindness. The officers excused themselves for a moment and stepped outside. They stood by their car, the weight of the situation heavy on their minds. One of them shook his head. "We can't just leave him like this." The other nodded. "No, we won't, but this is bigger than just a meal. He needs real help." They both knew that tonight was only the beginning. The call had started as a simple request for food. But what they had uncovered was far worse, a life of neglect, loneliness, and a struggle no one should face, especially not someone who had once served his country. As they walked back inside, the man was still sitting quietly in his chair, waiting. He didn't ask them what they would do. He didn't press for answers. He simply sat with the patience of someone who had been waiting for years, hoping that maybe, finally, someone would notice. The officers reassured him gently that they would make sure he had something to eat that night. The man nodded, his eyes moist, though he tried to blink it away. He wasn't used to being cared for anymore. That night, the 911 call revealed more than just an empty stomach. It revealed the heartbreaking reality of a man who had been left behind. The officers could sense it in their bones. This was not just about delivering food. This was about restoring dignity to someone who deserved far more than what life had given him in his later years. And as the man thanked them softly, almost whispering the words, they knew this story was only beginning. The two officers stayed with the old man for a while, talking softly and making sure he felt safe. But as they sat there, their eyes kept drifting around the small house. The dim light from the single lamp revealed more than what the man's words could tell. The wallpaper was peeling in places. Dust clung to the corners of the ceiling. And the air carried a coldness that hinted the heater hadn't been working properly for a long time. One officer quietly asked if they could take a quick look around. The man nodded almost apologetically, as though ashamed of what they might see. He lowered his gaze, avoiding eye contact while they slowly walked through the house. The kitchen told its own story. The shelves were empty except for a few mismatched plates stacked neatly as though waiting for a meal that would never come. The refrigerator stood silent, the hum faint, its shelves bare. Inside, the only thing was that single bottle of water, half full, sitting in the middle like a reminder of how empty life had become. In the small bedroom, the bed was neatly made, but the sheets were thin and old. On the nightstand lay a bottle of medicine, nearly empty, next to a pair of glasses with one cracked lens. There were no photos on the walls, no signs of visitors, no laughter echoing in the rooms. Just silence and the quiet weight of loneliness. The officers exchanged a glance again, this time with heavier hearts. It wasn't just that he had no food. He had no comfort, no support system, and clearly very little help from anyone. This wasn't just poverty. It was neglect. Years of surviving without anyone noticing. When they returned to the living room, the old man was still sitting in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. He looked up with a faint smile, almost as if to lighten the atmosphere. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but it's home." The officers didn't know what to say. They didn't want to embarrass him or make him feel like a burden. One of them finally spoke. "Sir, do you have any family nearby? Anyone who comes to check on you?" The man shook his head slowly. "No, not anymore. My wife passed away years ago. We never had children. Some neighbors used to check in, but people get busy with their own lives. I don't blame them. Everyone has their own struggles." His words were calm, but they cut deep. There was no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance. It was as though he had learned to live with being forgotten. The officers pressed gently. "Do you get any help from social services or veteran programs?" He gave a faint chuckle, though it held no humor. "I tried. Papers, forms, waiting lists. Sometimes they send me a letter, but nothing changes. My pension helps a little, but most of it goes to medicine. After that, there's not much left." As he spoke, one officer noticed his hands trembling slightly. Not just from age, but from weakness. It was clear he hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe longer. One of the officers excused himself, stepped outside, and made a quick call. Within minutes, he had arranged for some food to be brought over. The other officer stayed with the man, keeping him company. They talked about his past, his service, and his memories of a time when life was fuller. Slowly, the man began to open up. He told them about his years in the military, how he had traveled to places he never thought he'd see, how he had friends he considered brothers. His eyes brightened when he spoke of those days, but then dimmed again when he mentioned how most of those friends had either passed on or lost touch. "I used to feel proud wearing the uniform," he said, his voice soft. "People would shake my hand, thank me. Now I just sit here. The world moved on and I stayed behind." The officers didn't interrupt. They just listened, giving him the dignity of being heard. Sometimes that meant more than anything else. When the food finally arrived, one of the officers carried in bags filled with bread, fruit, milk, canned goods, and even a hot meal from a nearby diner. The smell of warm food filled the small house, and for the first time that night, the man's eyes welled up. He tried to thank them, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You didn't have to do this," he whispered. One of the officers smiled gently. "Yes, we did. Everyone deserves a meal, sir." They helped him to the table and laid out the food. He picked up a fork with shaky hands, almost overwhelmed by the simple act of eating something warm. Every bite seemed to restore a little of the strength he had been missing. He ate slowly, savoring it as though afraid it might disappear if he wasn't careful. The officers sat with him, not rushing, just keeping him company. They talked about small things, the weather, the neighborhood, memories of old times. It wasn't just about filling his stomach. It was about filling the silence that had hung over his life for too long. As the night went on, the officers began to notice even more. The electricity was weak. Some lights flickered as though the bills hadn't been fully paid. The heater rattled but barely gave off warmth. A few windows were cracked, letting in the chill. This wasn't just hunger. It was survival in its barest form. When they finally prepared to leave, they assured him they would check in again. They couldn't promise to fix everything that night, but they promised he wouldn't be left alone anymore. The man nodded, though his eyes told a deeper story. He had heard promises before, but this time felt different. These officers hadn't just knocked on his door. They had stepped into his world, and they had cared. As they drove away, the car was quiet. Both officers were lost in thought. One finally spoke. "It's worse than I expected. He's not just hungry. He's forgotten." The other nodded firmly. "We can't let this end here. We have to do something more." And so what began as a simple welfare check after a strange 911 call had turned into something much bigger. Behind the hunger, they had uncovered a life filled with struggle, loneliness, and neglect. It was far worse than just an empty fridge. It was the story of a man who had once stood strong for his country, now sitting quietly in the shadows waiting for someone to notice. That night, the officers realized they hadn't just answered a call. They had stumbled upon a truth that couldn't be ignored, and deep down they knew this was only the beginning. The next day, one of the officers couldn't stop thinking about the old man. He kept seeing the empty fridge in his mind, the cracked glasses on the nightstand, and the way the man had quietly thanked them while eating his first proper meal in days. It wasn't just another call to him anymore, it felt personal. He decided to return, not in uniform this time, but as a human being who simply cared. When he knocked on the door, the old man opened it slowly, surprised but glad to see a familiar face. His smile was faint but genuine, the kind of smile that revealed how much it meant to him that someone had actually come back. "I didn't think you'd really check in again," he admitted, his voice gentle. The officer shook his head. "Of course I would. I wanted to see how you were doing." Inside, the house was still the same, quiet, cold, and bare. But this time, the officer sat down and asked if the man would share more about his life. For a while, the old man hesitated, as though his story wasn't worth telling. Then slowly, he began to open up. He spoke about his younger years, back when he was strong and full of hope. He described the day he enlisted, the pride he felt wearing the uniform, and the friends he made who became like family. He had traveled far from home, serving his country in difficult times, seeing both the best and worst of humanity. As he spoke, his eyes lit up. For a few moments, he wasn't the frail old man sitting in a dusty chair. He was the young soldier again, standing tall with his brothers in arms. He remembered the sound of their laughter, the shared meals, the promises they made to each other. But as the stories went on, his voice began to falter. The brightness in his eyes dimmed, replaced with a quiet sadness. "Most of them are gone now," he said softly. "Some never made it back, others, well, life just pulled us in different directions. I lost touch with nearly all of them. The officer listened intently, never interrupting. Every word carried weight. It was clear the man's memories were both a source of pride and pain. He had given so much, yet now he was left with so little. When asked about his life after service, the man explained how difficult it had been. He had tried different jobs, worked wherever he could, but things were never easy. His wife had been his greatest support, standing by him through the hardest times. She had been the one to make sure the house felt like a home, to remind him he wasn't alone. But when she passed away, everything seemed to fall apart. I thought I could manage, he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. But little by little, I stopped keeping up. First the repairs around the house, then the bills, then the groceries. It all just became too much. I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need much. But the truth is, I did. I just didn't want to bother anyone. Those words hit deeply. It wasn't just hunger that had pushed him to call 911. It was years of silence, years of being invisible, until he couldn't take it anymore. The officer asked him why he hadn't reached out to veterans programs or community groups again. The man gave a small shrug. I tried, but there are so many papers, so many rules. They make you wait. And after a while, I just gave up. I thought maybe I wasn't the kind of person they wanted to help. There was no anger in his tone, just resignation. He had accepted being forgotten as part of life. But sitting there, the officer felt a surge of determination. This man deserved better. He had once stood tall for his country, and now he was sitting in a cold house with nothing. That wasn't right. Before leaving, the officer promised again that things would change. You're not alone anymore, he said firmly. I'll make sure of it. The man looked at him, skeptical at first, but then gave a faint nod. Perhaps deep down he wanted to believe. Over the next few days, the officer made calls. He reached out to local veteran organizations, churches, and community centers. At first, the process was slow. Some people gave polite responses, others gave excuses. But the officer didn't stop pushing. He shared the man's story, not to embarrass him, but to remind people of the debt owed to those who had served. And slowly, things began to move. A local veteran support group agreed to visit the man and assess his needs. A community food pantry promised to deliver groceries regularly. Even a few neighbors who had been unaware of his struggles offered to check in on him more often. When the officer returned to the house with this news, the old man sat in silence for a long moment. His eyes grew moist and he shook his head as though it was too much to believe. All this for me? He asked quietly. Yes, the officer replied. For you. Because you matter. The man lowered his gaze, overcome with emotion. It had been years since he had felt like anyone truly cared. For so long he had lived with the weight of being unseen, and now suddenly the world was beginning to notice again. As the days went on, his life slowly began to change. The first time a volunteer knocked on his door with bags of groceries, he could hardly speak. The first time someone sat down with him to help sort through his papers and explain the benefits he was entitled to, he felt a flicker of hope he thought was long gone. He still lived in the same small house, still wore the same old clothes, but something inside him was different. There was warmth again, not from the broken heater, but from the kindness of others. And yet, as grateful as he was, there was still a quiet sadness in his eyes. He told the officer one evening, I appreciate all of this, I truly do. But what hurts most is not the hunger or the bills. It's the feeling of being forgotten. That's the hardest part. Those words stayed with the officer long after he left. Hunger could be fixed. Bills could be paid. But the pain of being invisible, that required more than food or money. It required human connection, dignity, and respect. The old man's story was no longer just his own. It was a reminder of many others like him, people who had once given everything only to fade into the background. His truth was uncomfortable, but it was real. And it was far worse than just an empty fridge. For the first time in years, though, the man felt that maybe things could change. He had spent so long in silence waiting for someone to notice. Now finally people were listening, and as he sat by his window that evening watching the sun set over his quiet street, he whispered softly to himself, maybe I'm not as forgotten as I thought. The following week brought a change that the old man never expected. For years his days had been filled with silence, but suddenly, there was life at his doorstep. A gentle knock in the morning meant a bag of groceries had arrived. In the afternoon, someone would stop by just to check if he needed anything. At first, he wasn't sure how to react. He wasn't used to people caring about him anymore. He would often say, "You don't have to do this," but every time the visitors would smile and reply, "Of course we do." The officers who had found him kept their word. They returned often, sometimes with food, sometimes just to sit and talk. They realized quickly that what he needed most wasn't only meals, it was connection. He had spent years living in silence, and now, every small conversation seemed to bring a spark back into his tired eyes. One evening, one of the officers brought takeout dinners, and instead of leaving them behind, he sat with the old man at the table. For the first time in years, the man shared a meal with someone else in his home. The clatter of forks and the hum of conversation filled the quiet house, replacing the heavy silence that had lived there for so long. The officer asked about the medals displayed in a small wooden box on the shelf. The old man hesitated at first, but then slowly opened the box, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted each medal. He spoke softly about the meaning behind them, about the friends he had lost, and about the sacrifices made. His voice carried both pride and sorrow. As he spoke, the officer listened with deep respect, realizing that this man wasn't just a veteran. He was a living reminder of the sacrifices so many had made. Word about his situation spread quietly in the community. A local church offered to repair the broken heater. A group of neighbors pooled money to fix the cracked windows. The local grocery store arranged a monthly food delivery. People who had walked past his home for years without noticing him now came by to check on him. It was as if one small call for help had opened everyone's eyes to the reality that he had been there all along, quietly struggling. But while the support warmed his home, what warmed him even more was the kindness. When a group of school children visited one afternoon with handmade cards that said, "Thank you for your service," his hands shook as he held the papers. His eyes welled up, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "I never thought anyone remembered," he finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The children didn't understand the depth of his words, but the adults in the room did. They knew what it meant for someone who had felt invisible for so long to suddenly be seen, appreciated, and valued again. Slowly, his routine began to change. Instead of waking up to silence, he woke up expecting a knock on the door. Instead of sitting alone at his table, he often had company. Instead of feeling like he was just waiting for the days to pass, he began to feel like his life mattered again. One afternoon, the officer who had been visiting him regularly asked a question. "What kept you going all this time? Even with all the hardship?" The old man sat quietly for a while before answering. "Hope," he said softly. "Even when I felt forgotten, I kept hoping someone would notice. I kept hoping life might change. I guess I didn't give up completely, and maybe that's why I finally made that call." The officer nodded. He realized that sometimes all it took was one act of courage, like picking up a phone and admitting hunger, to open the door to change. The man's health also began to improve. With proper meals and warmth in his home, he slowly regained a little strength. He wasn't suddenly young again, but he looked less frail, his face a bit brighter. Even his voice carried more energy when he spoke. One evening, a group of veterans visited him. They had heard his story and wanted to welcome him into their circle. They brought with them stories, laughter, and companionship. As they sat together, the old man looked around the room overwhelmed. For years he had been alone, and now he was surrounded by people who understood his journey. He told them, "It feels like I have a family again." The officers watched from the side, smiling. They knew this was bigger than food or bills. This was about restoring dignity and belonging. Not everything was easy, of course. There were days when the man still felt tired, when the weight of years couldn't be erased by kindness. But those days were different now because he wasn't facing them alone. Someone always checked in, someone always cared, and that made all the difference. The community that had once passed by his small house without noticing it now saw it as a place of respect. Some even said, "We had no idea he lived here, no idea what he was going through." It was a lesson that stuck with them. Sometimes the people who need the most help are the quiet ones who never ask. The old man, once hesitant to accept help, began to see it differently. He realized that accepting kindness didn't mean weakness. It meant connection. And slowly, he began to share more of himself with those who visited. He told stories, shared memories, even offered advice to younger people who came to see him. His home, once filled with silence, now held voices, laughter, and warmth. As weeks passed, the officer thought often about how a simple call had changed so much. A call about hunger had revealed something far worse, a life of neglect. But now it had also revealed something powerful, the ability of people to come together to care, to remind someone they mattered. The old man himself summed it up one evening as he sat by his window, watching the lights of the neighborhood glow. "I thought I had been left behind," he said softly. "But maybe I was just waiting to be found again." His words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. And in that moment it became clear that what had started as a small act of compassion had grown into something much bigger. The officers, the community, the neighbors, they hadn't just filled his fridge. They had filled his life with meaning again. And though he still carried the weight of years and memories, he no longer carried it alone. The months that followed brought changes the old man never thought he would live to see. His house, once dark and silent, slowly came alive. The heater was fixed, warm meals became regular, and his fridge was no longer empty. But more than that, there was life again within his four walls. People came and went, checking on him, bringing food, sharing stories, and simply sitting with him. For the first time in years, he no longer felt invisible. One evening, as he sat by his window watching children ride bicycles down the street, he thought about how different things had become. Just a short time ago, he had been too weak to stand in the kitchen, too ashamed to ask anyone for help, too lonely to hope for change. Now he could hear laughter outside his door and feel warmth in his heart. "I never thought one phone call could change everything," he whispered to himself. The officers who had first answered his call continued visiting him often. They didn't see it as duty anymore, it became personal. Every visit reminded them why compassion mattered. They often brought small things like his favorite fruit, or sat to listen as he told stories about his younger years. Sometimes they brought along friends or colleagues who wanted to meet him. Each visitor left with a lesson. Kindness could change a life and sometimes even save it. The old man himself began to transform. He no longer sat silently waiting for the days to pass. He started talking more, laughing more, even offering advice to the young people who came to hear his stories. His words carried wisdom from a lifetime of experiences, struggles, victories, heartbreaks, and survival. People who had once passed by his small home without noticing now came to see him as a source of strength. Soon his story spread beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers wrote about him, describing how a single call to 911 revealed the silent suffering of a forgotten veteran. The articles touched hearts everywhere. Donations poured in, not just for him, but for other veterans in similar situations. Community programs were formed to deliver food, fix homes, and check on the elderly who lived alone. His small story sparked a movement of kindness that reached far beyond his street. When volunteers came to tell him how many people were being helped because of him, the old man grew quiet. His eyes glistened and he pressed a hand against his chest. "All I wanted was something to eat that night," he said softly. "I never imagined it would turn into this." His life had become a symbol of something larger. He wasn't just the man who had been hungry. He was the reminder that behind closed doors many others were struggling in silence. His story gave them a voice. One evening, a small gathering was held in his honor. Neighbors, officers, volunteers, and veterans all came together. They shared food, stories, and gratitude. When it was time for him to speak, he stood slowly, leaning on his cane but with his head held high. His voice trembled at first, but then grew steady. "I spent many years feeling forgotten," he said. "I thought I was just waiting for the end. But what I learned is that kindness can bring life back to anyone, even someone like me. I want to thank each of you, not just for the food or the repairs, but for reminding me that I matter. We all matter. Sometimes that's all a person needs, to be reminded they are not alone." The crowd fell silent, many with tears in their eyes. The officer who had first visited him looked on with pride, knowing that this man's courage to ask for help had changed not only his own life, but also the lives of many others. From that night on, the old man wasn't just a figure in a small house. He became a respected member of the community once again. People came not only to give, but also to receive, to hear his wisdom, to share in his strength, to remind themselves of what truly mattered. His final years were no longer filled with emptiness. They were filled with people, conversations, meals shared, and moments of connection. He often said, I may not have much, but I have more than I ever thought I would again. Love, friendship, and dignity. And though time continued its steady march, he no longer feared it. Each day felt like a gift, each knock on the door a reminder that hope never truly disappears. It only waits for the right moment to return. In the end, what had started as a quiet, almost desperate phone call about hunger became something far greater. It became a story of compassion, a story of community, a story of how one man's simple request reminded everyone around him of the power of kindness. The lesson was clear. Behind every closed door, there may be someone waiting to be noticed, and sometimes all it takes is listening to a quiet voice asking for help. That voice, once ignored, can spark a change far bigger than anyone ever expected. As the old man often said with a smile in his final days, "I called for food, but what I really found was family." And in those words lay the truth that no one is ever too old, too poor, or too forgotten to be loved again.